So here we are now on to our third case study. This time we're looking at the campaign to repeal Section 37(1) of the Employment Equality Act. Joining me to discuss this from the trade union side is Anne-Marie Lillis, who is primary school teacher and member of the INTO. She attended the inaugural meeting of the INTO LGBT teachers group in 2004 and was actively involved in the group until 2016. She was chairperson from 2013 to 2015, and she is currently principal of Dunleary Educate Together National School. From the political side is Aodhán TD, Labour Party spokesperson on education, enterprise and trade, and campaigner to end Section 37(1). Aodhán, can I start with you first? Could you maybe just fill us in on how the employment equality legislation came about and why it was that this section was included in it?
I can only assume, as a lot of departments are quite conservative and are quite careful as to, I suppose, have pieces of legislation passed that are not going to end up in the courts, that the underpinning of the constitutional right of a school to uphold its ethos, which was the problem we had to be within employment equality legislation. So 37(1) was an attempt to, I suppose, in their minds, safeguard the ethos of a religious institution or religious-run school or hospital. And it had the effect, therefore, of not just LGBT plus teachers or those working in the medical environments feeling this kind of cold atmosphere, but also people who were divorced, who were unmarried parents, anybody whose lifestyle did not fit with the ethos of a given school, felt that they could have their career prospects, inhibited, and that was the case. Now, it was never the case that they could be fired, but it was the case that legitimately, and I use these terms, not in the way that I agree with them at all, but legitimately or legally, I should say, that if somebody was to go for promotion within a school environment and their lifestyle was known, that could be used against them because the inference would be given that they were undermining the ethos of the school. So that was the reason for it, I suppose, was to protect that constitutional right. So what we had to do, not just myself, but others in the political sphere, and this was very much driven by the INTO, was to find a way to do this within the constitutional parameters, but to free teachers and others from this cold atmosphere that was created by 37(1).
Anne-Marie, this affected your members particularly because the INTO being teachers, and as we know, a significant number of the schools in this country are religious run. How did it impact your members?
Yeah, I suppose the great power that the 37(1) had, was really its ability to silence and to make LGBT teachers invisible. Sheila Crowley, the first chairperson of the group, she famously put it that it had a real chilling effect on LGBT teachers. You were always worried that if you were out in your school, could this impact on your chances of promotion? If there was a post of responsibility coming up in your school, or if there was a deputy principalship or a principalship coming up, you were wondering that, if you were out in the same way as all of your colleagues, if you talked about your girlfriend or your partner, or if you talked about socialing at, gay events like, the Pride Parade is coming up this weekend, you were always wondering that if you were, open about these things, could that actually be interpreted as undermining the ethos? Because I suppose that's what was really chilling about 37(1). You were kind of wondering, what does actually undermining the ethos actually mean? And could being openly LGBT in your staff room, in your classroom, could that be interpreted as undermining the ethos? So the effect it had was that people didn't talk about, their lives, like that. If you had been out at the weekend to Pride Parade, you weren't showing them the photographs, or you weren't talking about it, so it really had, I suppose, even personally, it had the impact of isolating you in a way. I had been teaching in my first primary school for 15 years. And, over the course of the 15 years, I had been out to a small number of people. I'd been out to friends and family for many, many years. But, never once was I asked, about my girlfriend, Claire, at the time, my now wife. But, and that was kind of after almost 15 years of sitting in the same staff room as some of those people. And it not only kind of silenced us, but one of the things it did was that it silenced all of our colleagues. It silenced those people who could have been our allies, because it had a real impact on school culture. You were kind of wondering, nobody felt that they could speak about it, even our straight colleagues, And when I look back at my time in my first school, it wasn't that they weren't being supportive in any way. I think people just didn't really know how to talk about it. And, and that was, the real impact of 37.1. It just kept people quiet. You didn't know how to talk about it, because you weren't sure what impact it would have.
And also, obviously, from that, it would have had a knock-on impact with students that you were teaching who may have identified as LGBT themselves, and not having any role models that they could look at, who were naturally there in front of them. That must have had an impact as well.
It was really hard. No, absolutely. And I think that the role models, we know are hugely important in children's lives. And, I suppose keeping this part of yourself hidden, that, if there were any children in your class that later in life identified as LGBT, those role models didn't exist. And that was hard. I remember years later, actually, bumping into a past pupil. I was out in a restaurant in Dublin, and this young man did identify as gay as an adult, and we had a great chat afterwards. But when I was in primary school, I often thought it would have been fantastic if I had been able to be open about who I was in exactly the same way as the rest of our colleagues. So it's kind of that there isn't much, extraordinary about LGBT teachers. We're teachers like the rest of people, but just not being able to be yourself was hard. It was really hard. It was a very isolated place to be. And you kind of felt that you were always hiding this really, this part of who you were, and you weren't being your full self. And that was very, very difficult. And for me, when the first notice about the LGBT teachers group appeared in the In Touch magazine in 2004, I can't begin to describe the impact that had, to see that the union was setting up a group for LGBT teachers. It was absolutely huge. And, for me personally, it was life-changing. I remember going to the first meeting. It was on the 26th of November in 2004. And when I walked into that room full of teachers, there were 14 teachers at that meeting, and there were 4 officers of the INTO. And John Carr was there. He was the general secretary at the time. And, it was just, I was terrified. There was part of me who was absolutely terrified. But the other side of it was, I felt like this huge relief, that it was kind of like, whoa, this is actually going to be okay, because certainly early on in my career, I would have kind of felt at times, that I seriously considered leaving the profession, because I kind of felt, actually, is there a place for somebody like me within the teaching profession? So it was great, as I say, that night in 2004. It was just such a relief to get that support, and kind of to know that I had the full backing of the union should I need their support, in a situation in school. So it was hugely important to that first meeting. And as I say, it's kind of I remember John Carr, he said at the meeting, he said like that every teacher within the union has a rightful place, regardless of your sexual orientation or gender identity. And to hear that, meant hugely important to me.
Well, let's move on to the campaign to actually try and remove the section. Aaron, can I come back to you for a second? There's a political aspect to this, because obviously, in order for this to be changed, it needs some kind of legislation brought forward and things like that. When did you start getting involved in the campaign?
Well, I was an ITO member. I was a primary school teacher, and so as has been said, like 37.1 became a regular feature of political speeches, or sorry, I should say INTO speeches that might be given by high-profile INTO leaders. So at Congress every year, it was one of these issues that the INTO wanted to see addressed. And I took great comfort from that, and that my union, the INTO, was taking this stance. And so when it came to Pride, we would go to the Pride Parade and the INTO would be there in numbers. And this was the key demand: 37(1) had to be amended or removed or repealed. And so there was a buildup of energy around it. And there was no opposition to it. Like in fairness to the Irish political system, in other jurisdictions, there's a lot of heat around these issues. Nobody could really justify it remaining, in its current form because of some of the rhetoric that you might hear in other jurisdictions, if you like. So when it came to government formation in 2011, and I was elected a TD, it was put in the programme for government that it would be addressed. And there was other things happening. Senator Ava Power, who was a Fianna Fáil senator, brought through her piece of legislation through the Shannon, and I brought a piece of legislation through the Dáil. And so there was a build-up of momentum around it. What was interesting was that there was no single member of the Oireachtas who was asking for the status quo. And the difficulty we had was always going to be within the departments and how it was going to square with the Constitution and all the rest of it. But some very powerful things happened. The INTO LGBT group went to our Snooksron. They met the president. And then when a photograph was taken, half the people stepped out of the photograph because they couldn't be identified in their own minds as being LGBT and teaching in a Catholic school. So there are a huge number of wider questions as to why the religious influence is so strong in Ireland over primary schools or over hospitals, why it has to be that way. I've had situations, and I know of situations, where teachers who are unmarried, who are pregnant, have gone to their principals and saying, "Is my job okay?" That's a bizarre thing for a public servant to have to experience, but we have a poor history of this. My mother left the civil service when she got married. So, we haven't always been great at protecting our workers within the public service. But that was the build-up. The INTO making a priority, it being the singular issue at Pride, and then the political system catching up, and then a programme for government commitment. And the very first time I addressed the Dáil in terms of promise legislation, there's a section in the Dáil scheduled every day where you get to ask the Taoiseach any question about promise legislation. And that was the first question I asked: was this commitment in the programme for government on 37(1? And he answered in a positive way. And we got to work, but the work is on legislation and amending it is a lot of copies of the Constitution and trying to make sure it doesn't get a challenge in the High Court, and trying to convince people that amending it is going to be better than repealing it, and those hard discussions that sometimes don't make you feel great, but the end goal is actually to make people feel less of the chilling effect, as Anne-Marie has said.
Anne-Marie, it's now gone. You're now a principal of a school, and here you are appearing in public, identifying as a member of the LGBT community and talking about this issue. Generally speaking, what impact, what do you think this will mean now for future teachers, and particularly young LGBT people in schools who also might want to go on and be teachers as well?
Yeah, no, I think, as Aodhán said, the removal of 37(1) was our original objective. But the amendment that has been put in is very, very strong. And what I would say to any person contemplating a career in education, absolutely go for it, because this amendment protects all teachers, regardless of the school that you teach in. I know a large percentage of our schools are under Catholic patronage at the moment, but this amendment protects teachers working in all primary schools. And I think that that's really, really important. It's not like, I'm working in an Educate Together school, but every school in the country must comply with this amendment. And I think that this amendment gives great certainty, and I would appeal to people to trust the amendment. The legislative change has taken part, but what needs to happen, and I suppose which takes a little bit longer, is that cultural change within schools. And I still think that cultural change, it's happening, it's beginning to take place, but it will take a little bit longer. But what we have behind us is very, very solid legislation that protects all LGBT teachers, regardless of the school that they work in.
And of course, we have to acknowledge the great role that the INTO played in making sure that that's what happened. Can I wish both of you, or can I first of all thank both of you for taking part in this, and wish both of you a very happy Pride this coming weekend. I know Aodhán is a great ally of the LGBT community, and I've marched with them on the parade on occasions as well. So wish you both a great weekend. Thanks again for being on our podcast.
Thanks, Carl.
Thanks, Carl.